Game 45, Bournemouth versus Luton Town on the 16th of December 2023. Taking it for granted. I take the train from Parkway to Marylebone expecting it to be full of Christmas shoppers going to the smoke for their presents. I am sat down after my usual far end of the platform position for a 5-carriage coach. It is a fairly busy platform and the first stop will be Bicester Village shopping area. Once we hit Bicester Village and stop, a lot of people alight, but it's very noticeable that the majority of getting oners had all bought wheelie suitcases. This has been a regular occurrence when stopping at this stop. I mean, this time it was so obvious that if you didn't have one that you had bought, you might as well have been stood there naked. But what I don't understand is this. People from all over the world come to shop at Bicester Village and they buy these cases. Now, did they bring their cases over in carrier bags, knowing they would buy a case over here because of the fantastic bargains, or are cases on wheels more costly in their country than gold bullion or real estate? I have walked through Bicester Village with my wife and it ain't cheap. It is all big brands with big costs associated with it. So just how dear are these fucking cases in their homelands? And get this, some of the ones purchased are cellophaned up for scratch purposes or have their own covers on in case of damage. Those people must have kittens when it disappears through the boarding gate. Just an aside in case you were wondering, there is nothing that 1 fits me in Bicester Village or 2 is in the right price bracket for me. The only things I can buy or wear from the high street shops are watches or Velcro shoes, because my shirts have more X's on than a porn channel. The train is at bursting point as it hits the last 3 stations into Marylebone, and it becomes a little fraught for people trying to get on. People shouting at the standers on the train, "Move down inside the carriages for fuck's sake, I've got to get to work." But the people around me play deaf, looking elsewhere, thinking that the person must be talking about others. It is only when the irate late worker slams his palm against the window that those who know what they were doing jump like startled cats. I feel guilty for having a seat and wonder what I would have been like. That is a thought that doesn't linger long, as I know I would have been an arse. At Marylebone, the chaos at the ticket reading gate is huge, and the other side, British Rail have sectioned areas off for dispersing shoppers or travellers in an orderly fashion to their respective destinations, i.e. out, underground or toilets. I meander towards Baker Street, grab a latte, and it's quite noticeable how the throng disperses very quickly within metres of coming out of the station. A reflection of those who regularly travel here, knowing where they need to be, and those who are up here for a bit of day tripping, being Christmas lights, a meal and a little winter wonderland. It's always good to spy the footwear. Your slim backs have now gone for flats or trainers. The tube is slow today and people are rammed in like sardines, and the double escalator up from the Jubilee line to London Bridge Station is full of going out outfits rather than the right outfit for the weather or the time of year. When on the escalators, it's a bit like a busy train. Exactly where do you look? More often than not, you're looking at the opposite escalator going down, to which you suddenly find someone looking at you, looking at them. Oops. Through the barriers, hang a left, followed by another left and up the escalator to street level. On this particular escalator, there is a glass roof because you come up around 20 metres from the base of the Shard, and it's one of those sights, sadly, that after a while, you take for granted. A bit like Oxford folk and the university buildings and architecture. That is real life. Sometimes we just take things for granted, but hold that thought. Into the studio and commentator envy ensues. I have Bournemouth versus Luton. This is a game where other commentators are glad they haven't got it, but cover their happiness in not being selected for it by exclaiming, "That'll be a banger of a game," or "That's got goals written all over it." I don't care, I have a game that a lot of people in our trade haven't got. They would gladly swap seats. Normal routine prevails and into the game. Now the majority of this game sort of disappears. All I can recall is an early Doughty corner sees Luton's Adebayo score before Dominic Solanke equalises. The half-time chinwag was that it was a good contest, or at least better than I thought, before the world stops. I think I've described that an awful lot of matches are now done off-tube, which means commentators watch a live feed with the pitch-side sounds being played on a clean feed into our headphones. Now there are benefits for the commentator, that air condition or a radiator are nice at this time of year, but we do lose peripheral vision. And when the world stopped in this game, I could have done with my peripheral vision. Luton, as I faced the pitch via my screen, were attacking the goal to my left. The Luton defence, who were just about on the halfway line, cleared the ball to my left and the camera naturally followed the ball. But it was headed back very quickly to the halfway line. Then a Luton player came into the view, right on the right of my screen, on his knees, and then fell on his face, not moving. At this point, there is every chance that with your peripheral vision you may well have been able to ascertain if it was an off-the-ball incident or not. Almost immediately people were rushing on. This suddenly looked very serious. Who was down? Goes through my head as I try to deduce in the melee which of Luton's back three was standing and which weren't. The manager, Rob Edwards, is then on camera waving people away, obviously distressed. I am now on slow-mo in my head with my commentary, trying to describe and not describe too graphically the complete urgency being shown on the pitch and the frantic work by medical staff. All I can recall in saying is there will be a lengthy stoppage for an instant, and in the meantime I'll hand you back to the feature game of the day. Tom appears and says, "Well done, who was it?" I say, "I think it's Lockyer." He replies, "Oh no, what happened?" I don't actually know. The camera panned back and he was out on his knees before going face down on the pitch. At first I thought he'd been elbowed, but then realised nobody was around him. Tom then added quickly about his collapse in the player final. Oh dear. I suddenly realised this was another Christian Eriksen moment. I saw him on the TV suddenly fall to the ground and the total fragility of life unfolded there. Tom got pictures into another booth as mine was effectively still live, so as I could sit there waiting for any pitch announcements, etc. It would have been catastrophic if I'd slightly, unwittingly raised a fader when telling somebody around what I'd witnessed, so it was best I moved to another booth. Tom Lockyer was resuscitated and was sat up talking in the tunnel after being worked on the pitch for 30 minutes, and the game was quite rightly abandoned. It brought home a terrible incident a few years earlier, and this is what happened. My wife was due to be released from hospital after a routine operation. Nevertheless, it was still a major one. On the day of her release, she was due out on a Saturday morning. When I arrived, she was sat up and dressed and waiting for her medications to come up from the pharmacy. It was a 4-bed ward, and we were chatting, me and my wife, and we couldn't wait to get home, and she certainly couldn't after a noisy night where 2 new patients had been brought in. Her bed was against the window and not one of the 2 nearest the opening out into the corridor. The little TV monitor on her bedside unit had Sky Sports News on. It was around 8:55 in the morning. The bed opposite had someone in who was a little down on his luck, and he was getting a haircut and foot treatment as well as treatment to what ailments or injuries he had. The bed on the diagonal had a young man sat on the bed who was chatting away with everyone. The doctors came round for their ward rounds and started chatting to him. You could hear everything that was being said without having to listen. They asked him a few questions about his aneurysm on his heart and how he was feeling. They specifically asked him if he had any gurgling on his chest, and he reassured them he was okay and didn't think he was as bad as they were making out. They left reassured by the gent and said he would be operated on Monday first thing unless he felt any gurgling sensations or sounds. After they left and within minutes of the doctors moving on with their rounds, he smiled over at me and my wife saying, "I think they're overreacting, I'm fine," and he got off his bed with his wash bag and walked off happy. I cannot recall how long it was, but it wasn't long before he walked back into the 4-bed ward. With his back to us, he grabbed the nurse's sink on the wall and exclaimed, "Help me, help me!" His head went back and he fell backwards onto the floor, and in doing so exhaled with the impact, firing blood all over the floor from his mouth. The nurses and doctors rushed in from everywhere within seconds and pulled the curtains around our beds in our ward. And then my wife and I witnessed several, we couldn't see the people, trying to save this man's life. They worked on him for half an hour, maybe more. We could hear all the requests regarding pillows, bloods and towels, and everything was urgent but very polite. It was obvious the aneurysm had burst, and as fast as they transfused blood in, it was erupting out of the burst aneurysm, and nothing could be done. It was 9:38 or something, and someone who was smiling and talking was now gone. When they did pull the curtains back, the staff were in tears and visibly shaken. My wife and I asked if there's anything we could do. That sounds silly, but what we were really thinking that was during the frantic efforts to save this chap's life, a person was summoned to phone his wife to come over quickly. We knew where she was coming from and knew it would be at least 45 minutes away, but we wanted her to know from someone else who didn't work at the hospital just how hard they had worked on trying to save her husband. We left very, very numb. We had a friend coming over in the afternoon and I was on commentary duties that afternoon. But the whole Tom Lockyer episode just reinforces what we have for a short while: life. I had to do a considered piece on the game for the outlets, and I got a little wrapped up emotionally in what Mr. Tom Lockyer had gone through, and said within my considered, "Mr. Lockyer, you have played in the Premier League, you have scored in the Premier League, and you have captained your side in the Premier League. No one can take that away from you. You have been given a third chance, and you have nothing to prove to anyone. Go and be with your wife and play with your children." Perhaps I shouldn't have, and perhaps I should have, but it was what I felt needed saying. So I did as I wanted. On the journey home I wondered about a lot of things, guilt being a big one, and I'm not going to go into that feeling and why I had it right then. Game 46, Luton Town versus Newcastle United on the 23rd of December 2023, titled Terrier Town. Merry Christmas, or very nearly, the last Saturday before Christmas Day and the last minute shopping, surely? Well, the Parkway platform is quieter than normal. I board and sit down. Vista Village and more boarders with suitcases bought. Are they giving them away, I think? We go through the normal stops and it's not as busy as one would have thought. In fact, it's very relaxing aboard the choo-choo. Space and no concerns. I spend time thinking about the game ahead of me and feel a little twinge of awkwardness for Newcastle facing Luton after the previous week's horror show at Bournemouth when the game was abandoned due to the Tom Lockyer heart attack scare. You just know Luton might not be the team to face today. I arrived at Marylebone with time for a wander down the road to Baker Street Tube Station with my obligatory latte. It was a bit surreal, really. The capital was quiet, almost ridiculously quiet. I really thought the old city would have been heaving, but it wasn't. Maybe the days of Amazon and holidays of workers starting on the Friday have meant most preferred to be at home than face the usual last-minute frenzy. When something isn't as you imagined, it almost feels like a dream. You know, if you dream you might be in a place which isn't what you recognise but you accept as being maybe your home, etc. So in your dream it feels right, but on being awake and recalling your dream it doesn't. That is perhaps one of the hardest things I've ever tried to explain. That was London, the last Saturday before Christmas, and all the buildings, but none of the imagined crowds. Also, a few shops were actually closed around London Bridge Station. There are quite a few outlets, not as many as Oxford Street, but it was noticeable that a few were closed. London was relaxed. I think a few hostelries were gearing up for a busy night, but that was for later. I have explained earlier that I felt today wasn't the best time for Eddie Howe's sovereign wealth funded team to play Luton, and I really expected it to be that way. But then again, I expected London to be busy. Just a quick question. Have you ever done this in your head? Been travelling to a meeting or an interview and you start playing out the meeting in your head, almost planning what would be asked and your reply, etc.? I've done it meticulously over the years, and guess what? It's always the scenario I hadn't played out in my head that occurs. I also don't get excited over upcoming things, and it always turns out piss poor, so I try to convince myself that it's going to be shit, and it usually is. Optimism in my life is the key to disappointment, so to that extent I never really look forward to anything. Glass half full? No, dried up and in the cupboard. Safer that way. So in a way, my thoughts on upcoming matches is often one of the last things to bother me. It will be what it will be. I'll also tell you another thing. If I believe someone is watching or listening or even get a tweet or interaction on my game, the level goes up a few notches. As a commentator, I would liken myself to a top 8 Premier League team. Consistent, capable of outstanding displays, and a little maverick for interest. More Villa than West Ham presently, and yes, I can hear all those dissenting voices here, more Forest Green than Cheltenham. Settled in and team news done, final prep and open up being put together. Newcastle, who should win here today against Luton, who are what they are, and carry out their duties to the best they can, who want to show solidarity as well to their missing captain. A few weeks earlier, the Toon bubble took a hit on the south coast when they lost to Bournemouth, and that sparked a little unrest with Kieran Trippier talking to the fans after the final whistle, so everyone deduces that life isn't going swimmingly from the side from the northeast, a fact borne out by the results of late. The game itself was won by Luton by 1-0. Andros Townsend scoring the goal at the back post and then raising Captain Lockyer's shirt up. But for me, it was more about the actual pattern of play of the game. Newcastle are a very good footballing side, and in terms of cost, Cost a lot more than Luton side, but Luton were like Jack Russell Terriers, always snapping in and around Newcastle and forcing errors, not being allowed to play their natural game because of the hustling and haranguing by those mad hatters. Luton hit the woodwork twice through Barkley and Brown, and Dubravka saved from Adebayo, whilst Isak had one ruled out for a very, very tight offside call from VAR. But Luton were worthy winners. I wish everyone in the studios a Merry Christmas and wander outside. It's dark and the large pub opposite it crowded with revellers. The tube is quiet and the train home is quiet too. I ponder mainly on the festive period which has arrived upon us like a runaway train. I have some gifts for my wife and we're out Christmas Day, but the days of Noel Edmonds on a Christmas morning going round hospitals giving unfortunate patients who are spending Christmas in hospital presents, or Top of the Pops Christmas special and Morecambe and Wise offerings have long gone. TV is rubbish now. Once upon a time you'd mark out in the radio and TV Times things to watch, but for this cynical old sod TV has changed. Back in the good old days celebs would appear at Christmas on game shows. It was novel. Nowadays, celebs who aren't really celebs pop up regularly on charity versions throughout the year, so therefore diminishing that festive TV feel. You don't even get a cinema blockbuster anymore. I smile at the thought of my childhood Christmases and yearn for those yesteryear days when I was innocent, when it was parties at my nan's and aunt's, etc. And finally half-term in October time, when Mum used to be cheesed off with us kids, and to keep us quiet, she would send us into the living room with the Littlewoods catalogue, or was it John Mayer's catalogue, to look at the toy section for your presents you wanted. But you knew those years were over when you headed to the women's underwear section. It happens, we all change, and so does the world. I arrive at Oxford Parkway looking forward to a drink and a rest, as tomorrow is Christmas Eve, and I'll be heading off to Malvern to pick up my eldest after the last panto of the day to come home for Christmas Day. No rest for the wicked, as they say. Game 47, Sheffield United versus Luton, 26th of December 2023, titled A Better Boxing Day. I was on the train to Marylebone and I was very much alone. No Boxing Day rush to London sales anymore. With internet shopping, it's sale time all the time. There are a few suitcase people who board at Bicester Village, but the big day is past. But it does throw me back to Boxing Day last year, which was an event all of its own. Last year, on the train to Marylebone, I had an uncomfortable belly, more akin to fullness rather than the precursory burbling stomach, which can lead to rushing to the toilet and dispensing with the lower limb clothing rapidly to avoid an outpouring of grief. It was very uncomfortable all the way to London. I remember grabbing a latte on my way into work and thinking, actually, I don't want to drink it, which is highly unusual. It was stuffy in the studios and felt like the aircon was on a hotter setting than needed. I was being kissed on the forehead with a light perspiration. There were a few bods in and I needed to pour the latte away, which I did in the kitchen area just outside of the studio entrance. I continued to work and the uncomfortable bowel issue needed sorting, so I took myself off to the toilets. Well, it was a gentle opening and with a full-on eruption late on in the piece. It actually caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that ending. Good plot twist. But I finished and wandered back to the studio, sat and continued prepping before my game. I recalled Tom and another commentator chatting by the side of my booth, and it was then, for some unknown reason, later to find out that I was feeling unwell, that the conversation was making me feel strange, almost as though I wanted them to piss off and chat elsewhere. I turned to Tom and said, "I'm not sure if I feel unwell." He said, "OK, let me know how you go." And he continued chatting alongside me whilst I prepped. And then I needed to go to the toilet, but not for twos. I made it to cubicle 1 just and proceeded to decorate this plush cubicle with projectile vomit. Oh, and by the way, I hadn't been this sick for years. Now I'm in a quandary. I feel awful. I must have some sort of bug. I managed somehow, with only toilet paper as a method of wiping up, to clean up my own vomit. I came out and looked at myself in the mirror above the wash-hand basin, and now I was red-eyed, blotchy-skinned, vomity-bearded, a sweaty old man who was shaking. I walked back to the studio and told Tom I can't get through 90 minutes. He looked at me, a trembling, blotchy wreck, and said, "OK, we have a spare producer who can drop in, so get yourself home." Before I'd packed my things up, I sprinted like Usain Bolt into the said number 1 trap and threw up again. Now, when you have kids or babies, they just at times, when unwell, give you no warning that they're going to be sick, and this is exactly how I felt. No warning, just a 5-second grab a bag situation. Now, why am I explaining this so graphically? Because I want to? No, because I want you to think about the situation now. My bowels are unstable and my vomiting immediate and spontaneous. I have a 20-minute tube trip to Marylebone, followed by an hour and 20 minutes minimum on the train, with the likelihood of a spontaneous outpouring from any orifice. I am nervous, to say the least. I managed to make it out of the office block our studio is housed in to the top of the escalators, one down to the tube and one up. I go down and come straight up before covering the pavement at the top of the escalators. In fairness, it does go partially into a drainage grating. Security personnel loom over me. Whilst gagging at the end of my vomiting, I tried to say, "Get me a bucket and I'll wash it down and away." Goodness knows what the families out on a Boxing Day walk at the base of the Shard thought about this old sweaty, blotchy geezer. My mind was froze with the fear of where next I would embellish everything in front of me. On the tube facing others, on the train home leaving a vomit trail trying to get to the train loo. I'm a long way from home and feeling vulnerable and very ill. Should I get a taxi? Should I buy a carrier bag? I make it to Marylebone and grab a seat outside a working toilet on the train and slump there, looking like goodness knows what on the seat. I call my wife and tell her what has happened and tell her to be at Bicester North Station as it was the first train to get back our way, and told her to have some bags with her. I fell into the car and she asked me how I was. I didn't reply. I just filled a Sainsbury's carrier bag up with more vomit. My wife couldn't understand why I didn't throw up outside the car. I tried to explain that there is no control over when these vomitaceous eruptions occur. She really didn't believe me that I had no control. I laid on the bed until I fell asleep, and for the next 2 days felt weak and drained. On the 3rd day, my wife wanted to pop into Oxford to look at the sales in some of the shops. I obliged, even though feeling very under the weather. We parked centrally and I wandered slowly with Rocco. I still felt like shit when I saw a friend and stopped to chat. My wife said she would head to this one particular shop she wanted to go in first. I chatted and stood there with Rocco, and after a time I thought I'd better move on towards the shop my wife was in. I hadn't moved very far when she came back the other way with a face like thunder. She stared at me and said, "We've got to get back to the car now." Somehow the poor lamb got home, and then she redecorated the downstairs toilet. It's only small, but the vomit came so quick that even though she was sat next to the wash-hand basin, she had no time to redirect. It was at that point you didn't want to say "told ya," but told ya. She was ill for days as well. It's all well and good being ill at home, but stuck in the middle of London isn't fun, I can assure you. So that was last year, and this year was the anniversary, and thankfully no issues. We chat over and natter about our games, and my Sheffield United versus Luton game is not too bad in fairness. Luton have found a little bit of form and United are desperate for points. Chris Wilder was back to his beloved Blades and trying to oversee a miracle in fairness. He won't have been impressed by the first goal. Doughty on the angle for Luton, firing at the Sheffield United keeper Fotheringham, who saw it go through his legs. I wondered then if that well-worn gag had happened in the change room at half-time, where he said to Wilder, "I'm sorry, Gaffer, I should have kept my legs crossed." To which Mr. W replies, "No son, not you, your mum." After the break, Sheffield roared back with 2 goals that owed more to goalmost scrambles than to open play sweet football to take the lead. Only for Luton to win 3-2 after 2 own goals saw them home. Not a classic, not brilliant, a hard watch and slog for the commentator. Not every day you say that about an incident-packed 5-goal thriller. The route home was quiet. Boxing Day had slipped by, as had Christmas Day. I got into the car at Kidlington and asked how my wife's drive to Malvern and back had gone this morning, as her eldest had to be back for the matinee of the pantomime he was musical director and playing in. "All okay," was her reply, before she started telling me about every loon on the road she encountered and the middle lane hoggers. It's all good, and the 3 of us sit back and see the rest of the night out moaning over the festive TV. Well, not Rocco, obviously. He can't talk.